Hi everyone. Today's lecture is dedicated to the foundations of human memory. This is a huge topic in cognitive psychology and neuroscience. And it also so happens to be one topic that faculty at UFT in psychology has taken a very keen interest over the course of many decades, ever since the 70s. And this effort and this involvement in the field from the part of our faculty has been recognized, as the textbook makes it quite clear, and as I will try to point out a couple of times throughout the lecture as well. Now that I have acknowledged the role of our institution of UFT in developing this field of research, let's quickly move through the list of objectives for today. And this is quite sizable, so I'm going to navigate through this list rather quickly. The first one is to describe the components of a major conceptual framework in the study of working memory due to Alan Baddeley, and how it matches across a network of areas of the brain. Then we will look into the possibility of distinguishing interhemispheric and intrahemispheric preferences for different types of material and processing demands. Then we will look into a fundamental theory of memory that points to the level of processing, deeper or more shallow, and how it improves subsequent memory, as well as the role of the IFG, the left inferior frontal gyrus, in facilitating deeper levels of processing. Then we will look at the relationship between encoding and retrieval of information, and what regions might be involved in these processes. We'll try to clarify the role of the hippocampus in storage and consolidation, and this is necessary since most people, when thinking about memory, do tend to think about the hippocampus. And this is a good association. Hippocampus is critical for memory, but it is by no means the only part of the human brain responsible for memory. So we should take a look at how the hippocampus relates to other cortical and subcortical regions for the purpose of facilitating memory storage and consolidation. Then we'll try to take a quick look at some topics, such as the relationship between emotion and memory, especially since next week we will continue our conversation with an introduction to emotion and its neural basis. And last but not least, we will look at the results section of an empirical journal article and try to make sense of it. So I will provide one piece of advice on how to approach it, and we'll practice that skill for a bit by looking at a few figures from a number of scientific articles. How should we get started on the topic of memory? This is a huge field of research in cognitive psychology and neuroscience. There are a lot of experimental paradigms and a lot of important concepts that have shaped the study of memory. But perhaps a good starting point is presented by a model published by Atkinson and Schifrin in the late 60s, the so-called multi-store model of memory. And we're going to start with this because it makes obvious a couple of fundamental assumptions in terms of how memory functions and how it is structured. Perhaps the most important aspect of this model, of this entire modeling enterprise, is to make obvious the fact that memory is not just one giant homogeneous process or entity, but rather it needs to be broken down into different components. And what Atkinson and Schifrin did was segmented or parse it into different stores: a sensory memory store, a working memory store, and a long-term memory store. And the idea of this model was rather simple, rather intuitive. What Atkinson and Schifrin suggested is that information, sensory information that we are bombarded with every single second enters a sensory memory store with a very large capacity but a very short time window. The information within this store is only available to us at the scale of milliseconds or perhaps seconds at most. Hence, a key aspect of memory is to be able to select relevant information from this store and transfer it into working memory. If you think about sensory memory as a loading bay for information, working memory would correspond to a mental workspace where we actively manipulate some limited but highly relevant pieces of information. And attention can go in both directions. So you can imagine that some limited part of sensory memory makes its way into working memory through attentional processes, but also working memory can influence what information reaches our sensory memory. So there's a constant interplay of those two systems. Now, working memory is essential to our ability to process memories. It is a core component of this multi-store model of memory. And this is despite its limited capacity. So unlike the sensory memory store, working memory is limited to a few chunks of information. But we actively manipulate those chunks of information so that whatever is truly important for us and we wish to recall at a later time makes its way into a long-term memory store with a much bigger capacity. If working memory lasts from seconds to minutes, a long-term memory store can last up to years or decades. And encoding is the specific process or mechanism that allows us to transfer information from working memory into long-term memory. Now, this would be hardly complete if information was just stored into long-term memory but not used later. So there is a converse process of retrieval that allows us to bring back into working memory information from long-term memory. So encoding takes us in one direction and retrieval takes us into the opposite direction. So now you can fully appreciate how working memory, or to call it by its older name, short-term memory, is such a core component of this multi-store model of memory. Because this allows us to combine information which is present, which comes through our senses at the current moment, with information from the past, right? So we are able to bring in together previous information and current information, and we manipulate it in such a manner to be able to, let's say, draw new conclusions or infer new aspects about the world around us or even about ourselves. For instance, if you're currently paying attention to this lecture, then you're probably looking at the elements on this slide and you're trying to actively think through the concepts related to memory. And you might also be able to anticipate that since we're talking so much about working memory right now, then presumably this is something that we're going to discuss in a lot more detail over the next few slides. And you would be correct in that assumption. However, if you're currently thinking about what you had for lunch, you might ponder over the taste of your entree or dessert. And if you're thinking about the rest of your day, you might start to plan what activities you'll be involved with and when and with whom and so on and so forth. So working memory can contain a limited number of elements. This is one of the major restrictions. But what is it makes up with is its processing ability, right? So the ability to bring in together previous information and current information, and to mix it in such a fashion as to allow an optimal outcome, drawing new inferences, selecting even more information which is relevant to us, directing our senses towards potentially interesting sources of information in the outside world, and so on and so forth. Another reason why this model is interesting, is important to us, is not just its multi-component store aspect, but also the distinction between stores and processes. Sensory memory, working memory, long-term memory, all of this are stores. They are repositories of information. However, we have active processes, we have mechanisms that work upon this information. For instance, we have attentional processes that takes us between sensory memory and working memory back and forth. We have encoding, we have retrieval processes, and all of them mediate between different components of the multi-store model. We also have active processes or mechanisms that work on information within the stores. So for instance, we have working memory processes that allow us to manipulate information within working memory. So again, this is a fundamental distinction between stores, repositories of information, and processes that work on information either at the level of a single store or mediating the transfer of information between different stores in this model. Now, one thing that you might wonder about is why stop here with the division of memory into these components? If working memory is such a important part of memory overall, is it really the case that working memory is a single memory store too? Or perhaps is it something quite a bit more complex? Perhaps working memory is in itself a multi-store component of memory. And you'd be right in suggesting that. But before we go into this, I should make one point clear, and that is the fact that sometimes whenever you look at the textbook and even at articles in the field, you see working memory referred to as short-term memory. And that is not a mistake. Short-term memory is an older name for what we nowadays call working memory. However, that term was deemed incorrect, or rather not ideal, since short-term memory has almost static connotation, while researchers like to emphasize the fact that this part of memory is highly dynamic and flexible. So these two terms are often used interchangeably, but we prefer the term working memory since it is more up-to-date, and it does indeed have the right connotation. It emphasizes the dynamic aspect of working memory. And this dynamic aspect is also due to the fact that we are not dealing here with a unitary system, rather with a unitary component. Rather, we have an interplay of multiple components that deliver to us what we call working memory. And this is something that was developed in the early 70s by Alan Baddeley, a researcher from York University in the UK. And what he did was try to intuitively describe what happens with working memory based on decades and decades of research. So he tried to provide something which is both intuitive, able to bring together and explain a number of experimental findings in cognitive psychology, and also bypass, or rather overcome, some of the limitations of the Atkinson and Schifrin older model from the 60s. So what Baddeley came up with is a hierarchical system that at the time relied on three main components: a central executive, a visual spatial sketchpad, and a phonological loop. Later in 2000, Baddeley also added an additional component called an episodic buffer to this model. Okay, so what do all these different components do? Well, briefly, the central executive is responsible for directing attention to different pieces of information. So in that sense, the central executive is in charge. Based on your current goals, you can allocate and direct attention to different types of sensory information. It also has the goal of coordinate a number of slave systems, such as the visual spatial sketchpad and the phonological loop, or more recently, the episodic buffer. What do they do? Well, another core idea of the Baddeley model is that visual spatial information and phonological auditory information, while able to interact with each other, have rather modular aspects, in the sense that their capacity is not a aspect of competition. So the capacity of the visual spatial sketchpad does not infringe or place any limitations of those of the phonological loops. It also goes well with the idea that memory relies heavily both on vision and on phonological, on auditory information as related to language processing. In a bit more detail, visual spatial information is processed within the sketchpad as related to, let's say, recognizing somebody's face, or trying to conjure up in your mind something that you've seen a while back, or while trying to be creative, trying to conjure up something that you've never seen before but might be in existence. So let's say if you're an artist. So all that manipulation of visual information in your mind takes place at the level of the visual spatial sketchpad. And there's also a finer distinction here between visual information and spatial information. If you're trying to find your way through a new environment, if you're trying to navigate based on a map, let's say, then spatial information is key in trying to relate your sensory information about the current surroundings with that higher level information about the geographical, about the topological structure of your environment. So all of that visual and spatial information is hosted in the sketchpad, and it is coordinated and manipulated with the aid of the central executive. Okay, what about the phonological loop? And intuitively, this is actually what most people think of when we talk about memory. All the verbal information that we're exposed to, assuming we pay attention to it, passes through the phonological loop. And we emphasize here the term loop because some of that information can be refreshed by being reiterated, by being rerun, so to speak, within this component of working memory. A good analogy, or rather an extreme example of that, is whenever you've been presented with somebody new at a party, let's say, and you don't want to forget the name of that person, hence you rehearse the name over and over again in your mind to be able to remember it later. And we tend to do this not just with somebody's name, but with a lot of different types of information. The phonological loop is essentially our ability to talk to ourselves. It's what mediates the inner dialogue that most of us associate with memory. Okay, so here we've got the visual spatial sketchpad and the phonological loop. Yet a lot of research has complained over the years that this is an incomplete model. And it is incomplete for a number of reasons. First of all, how do we relate information from different modalities? How do we put together visual information and phonological information? What about the other senses? What about smell and touch? Don't we have working memory for them as well? And this is exactly what the episodic buffer came in to do. It served as a limited capacity mechanism that can glue together, that can put together information from different modalities. Again, under the control of the central executive. An added attribute or responsibility of the episodic buffer, though, was also to timestamp memories. If you think about what you did last Friday evening and what you did last Thursday evening, those should be different memories. And for most of us, non-confusable memories. And this is because a specific sequences of events from the past is timestamped. We remember when things happened, not just what happened. And it is because of that timestamp that we're able to discriminate and recognize accurately events that have happened at different moments in the past. And that's exactly what the episodic buffer came in to do. Not only glue together information from vision and auditory domain and smell and touch, but also apply to those constructs a timestamp. And then all of this information can be transferred effectively into long-term memory. So what you see here at the bottom are actually different components of long-term memory and how they relate to the corresponding working memory components. For instance, the episodic buffer is related to the episodic long-term memory. This is a rather high capacity long-term memory store that encodes episodes from your past, sequences of events that glue together information, sensory information from multiple modalities, along with the corresponding timestamp. Similarly, for the visual spatial sketchpad, we have visual semantics. If you're trying to recognize somebody you're having an interaction with, you have to be able to relate that sensory information with the fact that this person is a male, that he's an adult, that he's a UTSC student, and possibly one of your friends. All of that information resides in long-term memory. This is visual semantics, and the visual spatial sketchpad is able to integrate and put together information from the past as hosted in the visual semantics component of long-term memory with current sensory experience. Last but not least, of course, the phonological loop relies on language. Both lower level components, our ability to parse out sounds into phonological components, into phonemes, into words, into sentences, to process syntax, and also to be able to identify the meaning of what is verbally available or processed. Okay, so these four components at the top provide a hierarchical model of working memory as proposed by Baddeley, while the three components at the bottom are the corresponding components of long-term memory, which enable us to see how working memory relates to long-term memory. Now, is this model without flaws, without problems, without challenges? Not at all. It is perhaps the most influential model of working memory. However, alternatives are available at this time, and people have criticized both the overall architecture of the model as well as separate components. So there's been plenty of work to try to understand and to bring more detail about the visual spatial sketchpad. There have been plenty of critiques of the phonological loop. And unfortunately, because the episodic buffer is a bit newer, there's quite a lot that still needs to be investigated about it. However, what is remarkable about this model is its longevity. This is something that was designed almost half a century ago, And it is truly amazing that something so old, given that cognitive neuroscience is a relatively young discipline, can still guide research. It can still guide research not just in cognitive psychology, but also in cognitive neuroscience. Over the last few decades, a lot of work has been dedicated to mapping Baddeley's model onto networks of regions responsible for working memory. For instance, the central executive was mapped to a portion of dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, while different subcomponents of the phonological loop, including the phonological store and the articulatory rehearsal, were mapped to areas of the frontal cortex, temporal cortex, and even the cerebellum. And that might come as a bit of a surprise. Why would the cerebellum play any role in working memory? But our conversation last week, you might remember that the cerebellum is involved in fine-tuning movement. And one particular aspect of it is to control movement related to speech production. So given that, it's not necessarily surprising that a part of the phonological loop relies even on the cerebellum. Similarly, components of the visuospatial sketchpad rely, as one might expect, on occipitotemporal cortex, as you can see here and here. And another component called the inner scribe relies on parts of frontal cortex and also parietal cortex. It is not the goal of this slide to further decompose components of the of Baddeley's model into additional ones, though that is definitely something that people have spent a lot of time doing in the field, or to identify the precise map corresponding to each of these components and subcomponents. Rather, the goal of this slide is a bit more general, to emphasize the point that working memory relies on an entire network that spans all four lobes in both hemispheres, and it recruits both cortical areas and subcortical areas. Hence, the questions that we often get from students naive or with little training in neuroscience: what is the area of the brain responsible for memory, is ill-posed. Memory, working memory in particular, is facilitated by a huge network of cortical and subcortical regions. One aspect of this network, though, as related to the central executive in particular, does deserve a bit more attention, though. And that's because it can illuminate some important aspects and distinctions in the study of working memory. And to speak to this, Mark Esposito and colleagues at the end of the 90s put together a meta-study, a meta-analysis of results from a series of studies dedicated to the involvement of the prefrontal cortex in working memory. What they did essentially was to look at a whole number of studies and illustrate exactly which part of the prefrontal cortex was involved in different types of tasks. And they did this first with spatial versus non-spatial tasks, where non-spatial is actually an awkward term for verbal tasks. So what you can see here, plotted in blue, is verbal tasks that recruit the prefrontal cortex when working memory is involved. And in contrast, you can see spatial tasks that recruit the prefrontal cortex again when working memory is involved. And what they found in this sense was not necessarily surprising. They found that the left PFC was more heavily involved in verbal tasks, while the right PFC was more involved in spatial and visual working memory tasks. And the reason I'm saying this is not surprising is because we already know that there is some lateralization. A lot of language processing in most individuals tends to rely a bit more on the left hemisphere than on the right. And conversely, a lot of visual recognition and spatial processing tasks tend to rely a bit more on the right hemisphere than on the left one. So it makes sense that working memory tends to rely differentially on the two hemispheres when dealing with visual spatial information versus verbal information. What was a bit more surprising at the time, though, was what happens when we contrast maintenance-only tasks with maintenance and manipulation. And this is a critical aspect of working memory, because if you think about it, whenever you have to rely on working memory, the easiest thing you can do is simply reiterate a piece of information. So for instance, if somebody tells you his or her name or a phone number, then what you can do is constantly try to rehearse that in your mind so that you don't forget it. And that is simply a process of maintenance. We're not actually processing any further that piece of information. We're just rehearsing it. We're maintaining it. We try to make sure that its trace does not fade. In contrast to that, we can perform a maintenance plus manipulation task. So for instance, whenever we perform a mental arithmetic type of task, so let's say multiplying two numbers, 11 times 12, then we have to go through the process of both maintaining that information. I need to remember that I am multiplying those two numbers, 11 and 12, but I also have to manipulate them, right? So I might choose to multiply 12 by 10, get an estimate of that multiplication, so there will be 120, and then I have to take another the result of an additional computation, 1 times 12, and add it to 120 to get 132. So while doing that, I have to remember different pieces of information. I have to keep maintaining them, but I'm also actively manipulating them to be able to get the outcome of that multiplication. And this is a much more complex task for working memory. So is there a distinction between maintenance only and maintenance plus manipulation? And what Desposito and colleagues argued at the time was that yes, there is, but this time it's not a distinction between hemispheres, but between the dorsal prefrontal cortex and the ventral prefrontal cortex. To be more specific, it was the medial, the lateral prefrontal cortex, which was involved in maintenance plus manipulation, while it seemed to be the inferior, the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex that was responsible for maintenance only in both hemispheres. Hence, we can see that the type of information seems to be segregated across hemispheres, while the type of task, the type of processing seems to recruit different portions of the dorsal versus the ventral prefrontal cortex of both hemispheres. Now, given what we know about the role of the PFC in working memory, what might we expect to happen if PFC is disabled or impaired in its functioning? And this is exactly what researchers looked at in the 70s, using rather crude but still effective methods in monkeys. For instance, in a study conducted in the 70s, Bauer and Fuster looked at the impact of cooling different parts of the brain with the use of an ice pack on behavioral performance, relying heavily on working memory, let's say in a delayed match to sample task. So you train a monkey on such a task until the monkey performs quite well, and then you can use an ice pack to, let's say, cool considerably the prefrontal cortex. And the outcome of cooling is that you're dramatically reducing, you're slowing down neural activity within that part of the brain. Rather diffusely. This is not a particularly precise method, but still there is a reasonable level of localization of the part of the brain that's been cooled down. So what they found is that cooling the frontal cortex, including the prefrontal cortex, has a dramatic impact on working memory performance. But if you're cooling the parietal lobe, then the impact is nowhere as dramatic in any such tasks that rely heavily on working memory. So how about being a bit more careful and embracing a finer grain approach to PFC functioning? So let's say that instead of targeting directly the PFC, we block dopamine, or we encourage the functioning of dopamine at the level of the PFC. And we already know from previous lectures that dopamine, as synthesized in the basal ganglia, let's say in the substantia nigra, projects via dedicated pathways to significant parts of prefrontal cortex. So blocking dopamine is expected to impair PFC performance. And in line with this expectation, indeed working memory suffers considerably after such manipulations, to the extent to which performance is comparable to a major PFC lesion or even a PFC complete removal. In contrast, if you use dopamine agonists, that is medication or substances that impact and encourage the functioning of receptors, postsynaptic receptors in the prefrontal cortex that bind dopamine, then the impact is quite the opposite. So for instance, one thing that we do know from a number of studies is that aging can involve a loss of dopamine function and associated working memory deficits in monkeys and in humans. So one question is, what happens if you try to reverse that process? If you try to use dopamine agonists to re-establish proper or close to normal dopamine functioning? Now, several researchers in the early 2000s looked at that issue, and they found that indeed they can do that by using dopamine agonists and re-establishing close to normal dopamine function in the prefrontal cortex. Working memory deficits in older monkeys can be dramatically reduced. So you're boosting the performance of the monkeys in tasks that rely on working memory. And even more surprisingly, they found that even after the completion of the regimen with dopamine agonists, even 1 year after those treatments, monkeys still saw a benefit from the treatment in tasks relying on working memory. And this type of studies are important not just from a theoretical standpoint, but also from the standpoint of developing drugs. Since if one can do this effectively in non-human primates with such long-term benefits, then presumably we can aim to do the same in humans via dedicated medication. And this is all the more important in that dopamine function is impaired not only as a result of aging, but in entire variety of conditions such as schizophrenia, ADHD, Tourette syndrome, and so on and so forth. Hence, there is a great deal of motivation to develop medication relying on dopamine agonists that can facilitate or improve working memory and attention capacity in these conditions. And this leads me to the next point, which is, okay, so this is how the biological system works, but what is the mechanistic idea behind the good or the impaired functioning of the PFC in working memory? And this has to do with attention, with our ability to filter signal from noise. Because of the richness of stimulation across many modalities, what comes in is the signal, things that are of interest to us, things that are relevant to our goals, along with a lot of noise. So the job of the PFC is partly, but significantly, to remove as much of the noise as possible, so we get a clearer picture of the signal. Hence, in blocking dopamine functioning effectively reduces our ability to remove the noise, while increasing or boosting the level of dopamine function is the desired outcome of increased ability to pull out the signal from its combination with a lot of noise. Okay, so this is not the whole story. This is rather a simplified version of what the PFC allows us to do, yet it is a major component of its role in how working memory functions. Now, let's change gears a bit and come at this from a different direction. And one of the things that have been prominent in the study of working memory ever since the 60s, especially among cognitive psychologists, was how to promote effective learning and memory. Whenever you're trying to learn a new piece of information, perhaps most of us appeal to rote rehearsal. That is definitely the most common mechanism. You're trying to remember somebody's name at a party, and you keep repeating to yourself, Chris, 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 to maintain that in your memory and to encourage its encoding into long-term memory. Is that successful? Well, it is better than nothing. However, rote rehearsal is rather limited in its ability to promote effective processing in working memory. Something that we also know from the older days of cognitive psychology is the fact that chunking, which means grouping information, may increase the capacity of working memory to hold information. So for instance, if I'm trying to remember a phone number, grouping it into let's say chunks of 2 or 3 digits can facilitate learning. It's one of the oldest and perhaps most famous contributions of cognitive psychology to learning, the fact that we tend to remember 7 plus minus 2 items. So if you can chunk information into groups of, let's say, 2 or 3 digits, then perhaps that means that the effective capacity of working memory can increase, since you'd be remembering 7 chunks of digits and not just 7 digits. And the same applies to many areas of life. So for instance, if you're trying to remember something by an acronym, the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area, or SIN, a social insurance number, abbreviations represent a common application or illustration of the idea of chunking in order to facilitate working memory efficiency and to increase, in a rather artificial but effective way, capacity. Still, this just scratches the surface in terms of what we can do to promote better processing in working memory. And it was in the early 70s when Craig and Lockhart from UFT published this paper on levels of processing. And this essentially led researchers to an entire new view on how memory can be improved and learning can be improved for new information. And the idea was quite simple. What Craig and Lockhart suggested was that information can be processed in a rather shallow manner, or it can be processed in a deeper manner. So then naturally the question is, what does deeper processing mean? Well, we already looked at rote rehearsal, which presumably is quite shallow. So how can we increase the level of depth of information processing? And Craig and Lockhart suggested that depth is associated with your ability to relate new information to prior information. So whenever you are trying to process the material in this lecture, if you effectively manage to link it with what you already know from previous lectures, let's say as dedicated to neuroanatomy or attention, then that will facilitate your ability to learn the material in this lecture considerably. And in much more mundane situations. So for instance, going back to the example of trying to remember somebody's name at a party, you can do the same. So for instance, if you just try to rehearse somebody's name, Chris again and again, that has limited use. But if you try to link that with some other piece of information, let's say that Chris at that party looks a bit like a Hollywood personality, let's say Chris Hemsworth, then that might facilitate your ability to better remember the name a few minutes later, or a few hours later, or a few days later. So relate current information with previous information is key to increasing the depth of processing and your ability to encode and retrieve that information later. So if this is indeed the case, then how might we be able to get to the neural substrate? If processing can occur at different levels of depth, what is the neural correlate of that depth? And in the 70s and even in the 80s, neuroimaging was relatively uncommon, but in the 90s, especially with the arrival of PET, researchers was suddenly in a position to answer those questions. And in one of the first studies dedicated to this issue, Kapoor and colleagues in '94 used the PET scan to compare shallow processing with deep processing of words. For instance, a typical shallow task would involve looking at a word such as dog or pants and decide whether each word contains an A or not. So the word dog shows up on the screen and you have to make a decision. Does the word contain the vowel A, yes or no? And the same for pants. While in contrast, a deeper type of processing would involve not just looking at the orthography, but processing the meaning of those words. So for instance, if I'm asking the participant, is a dog a living thing? Yes, you do have to process the orthography. You need to be able to read the word dog, but you also need to access its semantics. You need to figure out whether a dog is a living thing or not. And the same for pants, right? So dog would presumably result in a yes response, and pants no. And the key point here is that in both conditions, the participants see the very same stimuli. So if you apply the subtraction technique here, any differences that you might find will not be due because of differences in stimulation, in visual stimulation, but rather the differences would be associated with types of processing, in one case shallow and in the other case deep. So what did they find? Well, they found that whenever you're running a deep minus shallow contrast, activity seems to be more pronounced in the left inferior frontal gyrus. And this certainly makes sense because we already know that the left hemisphere, especially the left frontal cortex, is more involved in language processing than the right hemisphere. It also makes sense that we should see activity within the prefrontal cortex, as this is associated with working memory. And it's not just the case here that we're looking at conditions that make no difference in terms of memory. Whenever we're asking these participants to do the task with dog and pants in the shallow condition, they are less likely to remember these words than they are when processing these words in the deep condition. Hence, the activity that we see here in the left inferior frontal gyrus seems to be related with deeper level of processing, which has consequences in terms of memory encoding and retrieval. The way in which the authors explain this result is that the left inferior frontal gyrus plays a role in semantic retrieval. We're trying to retrieve the meaning of the word dog. It's an animal, it's a canine, and so on and so forth. And the same for pants and any other stimuli that might be presented in the deep semantic processing condition. And semantic information is just one type of long-term memory information. So it only makes sense that whenever stimuli are processed in such a manner, the left inferior frontal gyrus is more heavily involved. Okay, so this was happening in the early 90s, but eventually fMRI took off at the late of the 90s, and because of its better spatial resolution, a lot of these questions started to be asked again and try to be answered at a final level of spatial granularity and with increasingly more complex conditions, trying to answer more complex questions regarding working memory. And here is one such study by Ross Poljak from 99. And what Poljak did was think through the problem. We already know that the inferior frontal gyrus is involved in semantic processing, but we also know that the inferior frontal gyrus plays a role in phonological processing, the auditory aspects of word structure as related to speech. Hence, he tried to see whether there was any difference in terms of IFG recruitment in phonological tasks versus semantic decision tasks. And indeed, he found such a difference. Phonological tasks primarily recruited the posterior part of the IFG, while the semantic decision tasks tended to recruit a lot more the left anterior IFG. So at the same time, the study confirmed the previous results of Kapoor and colleagues from several years later using a different neuroimaging modality, and added a bit more detail to that information, in the sense that it's not the entirety of the IFG which is responsible for semantic retrieval, but rather the anterior portion of the IFG. Several years after that, Devlin and colleagues in the UK took that question to a new level of investigation. And they were in a position to address it by using a combination of fMRI and TMS. So what they did was to investigate the issue of multiple levels of processing, and they contrasted three different levels: a perceptual level, a phonological level, and a semantic level. So all in response to the same stimulus, let's say banana, so single words presented on the screen, were, as a function of condition, yielding three types of responses. So in one type of task, participants simply had to judge whether a line displayed on top of the word was shorter or longer than the word. And this is about as shallow as you can make a condition to be, right? You barely need to process the information associated with a word, since you only need to judge its length, right? So you're only responding with yes or no in this case. A deeper level of processing involves phonology. So for instance, you may be asked whether this word contains two syllables or not. So it's not sufficient just to judge the length. You actually have to come up with the auditory structure of that word, with its phonological structure, to be able to make that decision. And then in one even deeper condition, you have to process the semantics and decide whether this is a man-made or it is a natural object. So again, in all of these cases, you're making a yes or no response. And this is important from the standpoint of a subtraction method, because the stimuli are always the same across conditions and the response is always the same. Hence, any differences you might be able to see will be associated with the type of processing that you're committing yourself to as a function of condition. And what they found with the aid of fMRI was that semantics relative to phonology tends to recruit an anterior portion of the IFG. And this is great news, since it confirms Raspoljak's previous results. Also, in line with those results, Devlin and colleagues found that a massive portion of the posterior IFG tends to be more heavily recruited for phonology than semantics. And you can see additional differences between semantics and phonology across other parts of the brain, primarily within the parietal cortex. But the target of this study was the prefrontal cortex, especially the inferior frontal gyrus. Okay, so at this stage, this doesn't really seem to add that much to what we already knew from Raspoljak and colleagues. However, Devlin and his collaborators followed up on this with TMS. And the use of TMS here is particularly useful and informative, since many of these neuroimaging modalities like PET or fMRI give us correlational observations with respect to a particular neural process. So we do know that semantic retrieval tends to be more heavily associated with activity in the anterior IFG. But does that mean that the IFG is causally involved in semantic retrieval? Not just based on such neuroimaging findings. However, what TMS can do is disrupt activity at the level of this region in the AIFG and see whether the impact is reflected correspondingly on behavioral performance in a semantic task, and let's say in a phonological or perceptual task as well. And that's exactly what Devlin and colleagues did. They applied repetitive TMS as well as single pulse TMS to this area of the IFG. So what happens when you do that? Well, what they noticed was that in the semantic condition, the application of repetitive TMS slowed down reaction times by about 70 milliseconds when compared to a condition where no TMS disruptive signal is applied to this region. However, whenever you do this in the perceptual task, the disruption of activity within the anterior IFG to this region had no significant impact on reaction times. So it didn't seem to matter in the perceptual task whether TMS or no signal was applied to this region. And a bit more information was acquired by the application of single pulse TMS, which can be delivered at various times after stimulus onset. And this can both confirm the findings with repetitive TMS and find exactly at what moment in time the disruption of activity within the IFG has a quantifiable significant effect on behavioral performance. And they found that about 250 milliseconds after the word appeared on the screen, applying the TMS signal here led to a about 60 to 70 millisecond increase in reaction time, hence decreased performance, which tells us that semantic retrieval tends to occur around 250 milliseconds after visual stimulus presentation. And in contrast, there was no significant increase in reaction time in the perceptual task, irrespective of when the TMS signal was applied to the anterior IFG. So again, this confirms the findings with repetitive TMS. So two different versions of TMS, convergent results with the importance of the anterior IFG for semantic retrieval. Now, this is what happens in an experiment with a population of neurotypical adults. So this impairment is very short-lived, but you might expect that in case anterior IFG function is extensively impaired because of, let's say, damage or disease, then problems with semantic retrieval are a lot more pronounced and long-lived. And this is indeed the case. Furthermore, I would note that over the last 2 decades, a number of studies looking into the impact of sleep deprivation on metabolic processing in the brain found that the frontal cortex, including the IFG, are a lot more sensitive to this type of manipulation rather than other parts of the brain, let's say the parietal lobe or the occipital lobe. Hence, sleep deprivation has the expected outcome of difficulties with semantic retrieval, attention, complex decision making, and working memory deficits, or rather difficulty with working memory tasks more generally. And that is definitely something to keep in mind as you study for the final and more generally in your everyday life. Okay, so far we have focused quite a bit on verbal aspects of working memory, including but not limited to semantic retrieval. What about working memory tasks that rely a bit more on visual information? And the study by Brewer and colleagues from '91 is one such study. It is a landmark study in the memory literature, both because of its theoretical significance and because of its popularity. Not only did it substantiate a number of claims about neural mechanisms of memory encoding and retrieval, but it made at the time a lot of non-believers or skeptics in the value of fMRI believers and even practitioners, users of fMRI. And why is that the case? Well, the idea of the study was actually quite simple. Brewer and colleagues presented participants with images of indoor or outdoor scenes, such as those shown here, and they asked the participants to judge them. Is this an indoor or an outdoor scene? Presumably, this is an outdoor scene. Is this an indoor or an outdoor scene? Presumably, this is an indoor scene. And this represents one example of deep processing as applied this time not to word but to images. What's critical though is that while participants performed this task, they were also scanned using fMRI. And after the completion of fMRI scanning, participants were given a memory test for those pictures. They were asked to see whether they could remember these images. Was this shown in the test or not? Was this shown previously or not? So in this case, we're dealing with retrieval. So we scanned participants during encoding of information, and we tested them behaviorally during retrieval. And what they found is that activity in the right frontal cortex was much more pronounced during encoding for items that were remembered at a later time. So this is more active relative to items that were forgotten, and even relative to items that participants thought might be familiar but could not quite remember them. So this is important for a number of reasons. First of all, yet again, it shows us that frontal cortex, in particular prefrontal cortex, is important for working memory. It also confirms the value of the right frontal cortex for visual information, while the left frontal cortex is more heavily involved in verbal information. It also allows us to link encoding and retrieval. Perhaps it is the same parts of the brain that are involved in encoding information and in retrieval. Furthermore, they show that other parts of the brain, not just the frontal cortex, but the left parahippocampal cortex and the right parahippocampal cortex also exhibit somewhat similar results, more activity for items that are remembered at encoding than for items that are forgotten. And this should not necessarily come as a surprise, because I previously mentioned that a part of the parahippocampal cortex, the so-called parahippocampal place area, is involved in scene processing. So since we're dealing with scene images here, it seems that these visual areas might also be able to facilitate learning. And this goes to show that memory relates to many other mechanisms, not just with attention, but also with language, and in this case with perceptual processing, with object recognition. Furthermore, from a practical standpoint, this illustrated in a striking manner the ability of neuroimaging to predict outcomes. So this time we're not just looking for neural mechanisms involved in memory processing during encoding or retrieval, but we're actually in a position to tell you in advance which items you will have a better chance of remembering and which items you'll have a poorer chance of remembering. And this is quite remarkable. Right? So it shows you a mechanism linked to better memory, which relies on higher activation of certain key areas involved in the processing of this stimuli in their encoding. And it also provides a practical application of this, the ability to predict, to tell in advance what will be learned and what will be forgotten. This study, though, also leads to an interesting question, though, and that is, okay, we've managed to associate so far the frontal cortex, especially the prefrontal cortex, with encoding and retrieval, which are processes. What about storage? Is this also where information is actually stored? And to answer this question, in a study, in an fMRI study, Donahue and colleagues in 2005 tested memory for rules, for traffic signs, with a critical manipulation. They tested memory for old signs, for traffic signs that people have been familiar with for a long time, those in North America where the study was conducted. And in contrast to that, to newly learned traffic signs in other countries, with signs that participants were not familiar with in advance. So prior to scanning, participants had to learn a whole set of new traffic signs, and then their memory for these signs was tested in the scanner. So participants were presented both with old signs, which they didn't have much trouble recognizing and remembering, and associated a specific rule, a specific meaning to, but also newly trained traffic signs. And some of them were remembered correctly, some of them were not remembered correctly. And for the time being, we are going to neglect what happened with the incorrect trials, but we're going to focus instead on the difference between old signs and correctly remembered, newly trained signs. And for both of them, activation was found in the right IFG, which is not necessarily a surprise, since this is important for working memory tasks and for visual information. However, they found a clear difference between the level of activation corresponding to newly learned signs versus old signs. There was more activity for the former than the latter. So this is in line with the idea that the IFG is important for retrieval, because retrieval of newly learned information which is less consolidated, this should be more effortful, and that should be reflected in the resources allocated by the corresponding cortical area to facilitate that process. So clearly the right IFG is considerably involved in retrieval. What about other parts of the human brain which are traditionally associated with memory processes? And one of them is located in the middle temporal lobe, to be more specific, in the left middle temporal lobe. And here what the authors found is that while activity was clearly detected for both old and for trained signs, there was not a significant difference between the two conditions. And this serves as an illustration, or rather further evidence for the claim that the middle temporal lobe, or specific part of it at least, is involved in the storage of information rather than in retrieval. So to effectively be able to remember a piece of information, you might need, in this case, the right IFG to reach, so to say, into the left posterior middle temporal gyrus and extract that information. So the level of activity of the middle temporal gyrus will not be different across conditions, but the right IFG might need to work a bit harder for newly learned information to be able to pull it out of the memory store, which is presumably also relying on the middle temporal gyrus. And this conveniently leads us into the next part of our discussion, which is related to long-term memory. Okay, so now that we reached the midpoint of the lecture, let's take a look at what initially cognitive psychologists and later neuroscientists thought about the structure and the neural basis of long-term memory. And one of the best known distinctions in the field related to the components of long-term memory is the distinction between declarative memory and non-declarative memory, or explicit memory versus implicit memory. The first one contains memory for events known as episodic memory. What did you have for breakfast yesterday? How did you spend your 15th birthday? And memory for concepts, for facts, for rules. And this is semantic memory. What is the meaning of a given word? What is the meaning or the rule associated with a traffic sign? In contrast to this, we have things such as procedural memory, which concerns our ability to know how to do things, how to tie your shoelaces, how to drive a car or to ride a bike. So these are also forms of memory, and they are rather distinct and relying on different memory systems. Now, the focus of the present lecture is very much on declarative memory. However, it is important to understand why researchers believe that these are indeed different memory systems. And a lot of the initial evidence for that came from neuropsychology, especially from the classic case of patient HM. This was a patient who, in the 70s, suffered from intractable epilepsy. So that's epilepsy that could not be treated by any kind of medication or any kind of behavioral therapy. So his doctor at the time, Dr. Scoville, suggested the removal of both medial temporal lobes, including the hippocampus, in order to preclude further seizures. This was a rather radical procedure, and at the time it was not particularly well known, the involvement of the medial temporal lobes in memory functioning. Hence, the doctor was rather quick in providing this as a possible solution for the treatment of epilepsy. And indeed, the procedure, the neurosurgery, was successful in dealing with epilepsy, in removing the seizures, since presumably this part of the brain contained the area triggering the seizures. However, unfortunately, by removing such a huge part of cortex, and you can see here, you can appreciate the extent to which this resection of the brain removed a significant volume of cortex and also of white matter. This led to what we know today as anterograde amnesia. What this means is that HM had difficulty remembering recent events. Essentially, everything that happened after the surgical procedure. Whenever you, for instance, would be introduced to HM, for the extent of your conversation or your interaction with him, he could remember your name, but let's say you disappeared from view for a few minutes and then you came back, he would not be able to remember your name or even the fact that he met you at that time. So essentially, he drew a blank for the entire period of time between surgery and the current moment in time. These were severe anterograde amnesia and irreparable. No improvement in his condition was recorded over the years. In addition to this, he also suffered from a temporally graded retrograde amnesia. And when we talk about retrograde amnesia, we refer to amnesia relative to events after the occurrence of injury, or in this case, surgical procedure. And for HM, this was temporally graded in the sense that events several months prior to the surgery and were no longer accessible, but let's say everything from his childhood could be remembered with vivid detail. So this was not a full-blown severe retrograde amnesia, but rather a temporally graded version of retrograde amnesia. And as a side note, this is also something that we may be able to see in Alzheimer's disease patients. Many of them suffer from anterograde amnesia, and then temporally graded retrograde amnesia kicks in, so that bigger and bigger chunks of time relative to the present become unavailable, to the point to which the only thing someone might be able to remember are events from their childhood. Okay, so at this stage, we know that HM suffered from amnesia, both anterograde and to some extent retrograde, and this concerned primarily declarative memory. What about procedural memory? And a lot of researchers were quite keen to investigate that. So, for instance, one way in which he was tested was to complete a task relying on visual-motor coordination. He was asked to draw the contour of an object by looking at the reflection in a mirror. So this is not a particularly difficult task, but it is awkward, especially if this is the first time you do it. So HM performed this during one session. Then he was invited back for a second session. He was asked whether he had any memory of his performance in the task, and of course he said that he had no memory of it. He did not believe that it happened. Yet his performance seemed to improve. And his performance improved even better during the third session. So across a number of sessions of training, of executing this task, there was concrete quantifiable evidence of successful procedural learning and memory associated with it. And this was one of many striking examples of how procedural memory can still be intact, can still be functioning well, while memory for events can be severely impaired. Nowadays, we are aware of many patients and many different patient populations within which one type of memory, declarative, is impaired while the other one is intact, and vice versa. So there's plenty of evidence at this time that we indeed rely on different memory systems to support our memory for events, or semantics on the one hand, and non-declarative memories such as those supporting procedural learning on the other hand. So we have learned quite a bit about memory and about the importance of the medial temporal lobes in assisting and facilitating memory processes based on patient HM. But over the last few decades, we have also learned quite a bit from the study of neurotypical adults. For instance, combinations of behavioral studies with neuroimaging, such as fMRI, have led to some interesting conclusions about the involvement of the medial temporal lobe, and especially the hippocampus, in how we are able to remember information. So, for instance, in a typical memory experiment, people are often asked to look or make judgments about a series of words. And in this particular instance here, we have a schema of an experimental design in which participants were presented with words such as nickel and deer, and they had to judge some words for their size and some for the animacy of the concepts that they represented. So this matters a bit less, but what matters is after you are presented with several dozen words, you are asked to look at a series of, or at a list of words that contains some of the old ones, some of the words that have been presented during the experiment, and some new words that were not previously presented. And you are asked both to identify the words that you believe are old, and also to quantify your recognition confidence. If you think this word has been presented before, how confident are you that you've seen it before on a scale from 1 to 6? And it is the nature of memory that we tend, by and large, to be fairly confident in our memories. So whenever engaged with such a task, you can see that recognition confidence tends to peak in favor of good recognition of older items, and low recognition confidence is typically minimal. Similarly, we're quite good at identifying new items amongst old items. So you can see that here. The highest bars here are associated with 6 for definitely old and 1 for definitely new. However, we also make errors. And it is quite interesting to see how errors compare with correct responses and what brain areas signal a meaningful, a significant difference between such different words, such different occurrences. And Many experiments have been conducted using this paradigm. So here's just one exemplary case of the involvement of the medial temporal lobe and the frontal cortex in correct recollections. So whenever you remember things correctly, you tend to see a bit more activation in areas such as the posterior hippocampus and the posterior parahippocampal area. Sometimes even in the fusiform gyrus as associated with sensory processing, and this is perhaps a bit more involved if you're processing things that relate to objects and faces. And you can also see activity in the frontal cortex, which again is higher in the presence of correct recollections. And this is interesting. So both the left hippocampus and the right hippocampus show high level of activity as recorded by fMRI when compared to misses or correct rejections. So higher level of activity when you see words that you correctly recognize versus words that you falsely believe that are new, though you have seen them before, or words that you correctly identify as new. And what's further interesting here is that when you compare correct recollections with a feeling of familiarity, there's also quite a noticeable difference. So it seems that the hippocampus is responsible not just for a feeling of familiarity, but actually for the proper, complete retrieval of an item with all its detailed information. So to be a bit more clear, how is correct recollection different from familiarity? Well, to tweak a previous example, correct recollection would be, let's say, remembering somebody that you have seen at a party and then being able to suddenly remember that, oh, his name is Chris and I met him at that party a couple of weeks ago. Well, a correct familiarity would be to spot Chris on a street, let's say, a few weeks later and think to yourself, oh, he looks so familiar. I'm sure I've met him before, but I can't quite remember where and what his name is. So that would be a distinction between recollection and familiarity, and it's been studied extensively in psychology and cognitive neuroscience. And the point that we should be able to make based on this graph is that the hippocampus tends to care a lot more about recollection than just familiarity. And this also links to a rather interesting topic. That is the topic of false memories, confidence in memories of events that haven't really happened. Confidence that we have seen something or perceived an event that did not really happen. And this has a lot of theoretical and practical implications. So for instance, false memory about people is quite relevant for eyewitness testimony. Oh, I've seen that person at the scene of a crime when in fact that person was not there. Or yes, I've seen broken glass at the scene of an accident, let's say of a car accident, even though that did not happen. There was no broken glass. So there's been a slew of studies, both in psychology and in cognitive neuroscience, to try to understand both how often that happens, what are the conditions that prime us to experience false memories, and also what are the cortical regions that support false memories. So for instance, one of the findings related to false memories is that they tend to rely a bit more on frontal areas than actual memories, but a bit less on sensory areas. So a real memory tends to rely a bit more on activity, let's say on visual areas, if what I'm trying to remember has a visual component, while a false memory does not rely as much on those sensory areas. However, in the interest of time, I will direct you to the textbook, which has a really good section on this particular topic of considerable interest to the field. So if the hippocampus is so important for memory encoding and retrieval, does it also mean that it is a store for those memories, for information from various perceptual modalities? And the answer is both yes and no. One of the fundamental theories in the field that tries to articulate and clarify the role of the hippocampus in memory consolidation is called, quite suitably, the cortical memory consolidation theory. And I should know that Maurice Moscovich has been one of the most significant names in the development of this theory and in the study of memory using psychology and neuroscience tools over the last 5 decades. And he so happens to still be an active member of the faculty in the Department of Psychology downtown. Okay, so what does this theory claim that the hippocampus actually does? Well, it claims that a memory trace to be formed, to be stored, relies heavily on the hippocampus. Memory encoding relies on the hippocampus. It cannot properly happen without bringing into play the hippocampus. However, over the span of hours, days, weeks, and even months, information from the hippocampus is transferred slowly to different parts of the cerebral cortex. And this is an interesting process because when information is thus transferred, what we tend to transfer is the gist of that information, the bigger picture, so to say. And a lot of the detailed information may be lost in that transition, in that transfer. As a result of this transfer, over time, a piece of information might be completely relying on cerebral cortex and much less, or not at all, on the hippocampus. And I'm saying a lot less because for some memory that we still have the ability to access very vividly, in particular autobiographic memories. So perhaps some very vivid memories as associated, let's say, with an accident or with another moment that is very important to us. Those type of memories seem to have a twofold reliance both on cortex and on the hippocampus. And this is a specific contribution to this theory from Professor Moscovich. Okay, so if this is what happens, what about the prefrontal cortex? Well, this does not really change relative to what we mentioned in the past. What prefrontal cortex does is whenever information is needed, reach into the medial temporal lobe, including the hippocampus, to retrieve that information. And then the hippocampus can share that information with the prefrontal cortex, or can reach to an appropriate area of cortex where that memory is hosted. So memory consolidation, along with memory encoding and retrieval, relies on the interplay between the hippocampus, the different parts of the cortex where information might be stored, and the prefrontal cortex that hosts what badly called the central executive. Okay, so now what about consolidation per se? How does that occur? And this could easily be a course in itself. However, in the interest of time, I would note one particular aspect of consolidation which is very well known and which has been extensively researched. And this is the role of sleep for consolidation. It seems that the hippocampus and the cortex establish a unique and a very efficient mode of communication and of transferring information during sleep. So essentially, a lot of the memory consolidation occurs during sleep. Hence, if you're trying to recall information for your exam, if you're trying to maximize your learning, one of the best things you can do, as trivial as that might sound, is to actually sleep on it. Now, sleep is not the only strategy that comes into play. over the span of several years, I've been involved in studies that show that appropriately timed breaks in the process of learning can also improve learning. So sometimes taking a break, even for a few minutes, can be more beneficial to recall later than continuing to learn or rehearse the same information. However, the optimal duration of a break and its timing relies both on the type of material that you're trying to learn and on personal characteristics, even for neurotypical adults. Now, since I did mention types of memories with rich emotional content and the involvement of both cortex and cerebral cortex and hippocampus in them, perhaps it is a good idea to briefly mention a few facts about emotions and memory. All the more so given that next week we will have a full-blown lecture on the topic of emotions. And there's plenty of evidence that there is an evolutionary link between emotion and memories. At the very least, we create memories of things that we like so we can approach them, experience them in the future again, and memories of things we dislike so we can avoid them effectively in the future. One of the topics that has been extensively researched since the 70s is so-called flashbulb memories. Very vivid memories associated with autobiographical events. So events associated with experiences that had a rich emotional content. For instance, in the 2000s, the study of flashbulb memories was largely revived by looking at how and what people experience in relationship with the events of 9/11 2001. And many believe that they could recall with a great detail where they were and what they were doing at the time of the events of the World Trade Center. However, research to the accuracy of such flashbulb memories revealed that the added vividness component did not necessarily benefit the accuracy of those accounts. So while initially researchers believed that flashbulb memories, because of that emotional component and because of their vividness, would also contain a lot more accurate content, when in reality that doesn't necessarily seem the case. A rich emotional content can just as much hurt the accuracy of a memory. Another thing that we should be aware of is the importance of the amygdala for emotion-rich memories. And again, we're gonna talk a bit more about the amygdala next week. But for now, I will mention the fact that this subcortical area, small subcortical area that sits on top of the hippocampus in both hemispheres, is really important for memory consolidation when it comes to emotional memory. Accordingly, if damage occurs to the amygdala, that can really impair the consolidation of declarative memories with emotional content. And also we find that the amount of activation within the amygdala is clearly linked to recollection of emotional information. Okay, so now what happens if the circuit that relies on the amygdala and the hippocampus becomes overloaded? What happens if this relationship is somewhat compromised? Well, this is related to the study of many conditions. So, for instance, the amygdala has been extensively studied in relationship to the post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. As many of you might know, this is an anxiety disorder linked to traumatic events. It is especially common amongst people who experienced war events, but also civilian tragedies. And one of the outcomes or one of the symptoms of PTSD is often described as the brain being on loop, a constant reliving of a very vivid traumatic experience that cannot be effectively stopped. So as traumatic as the event in itself was, you can only imagine how much worse the situation is of an individual suffering from PTSD to constantly have to relive that experience over and over and over again, just because the memory of that event is so vivid. So again, this seems to rely on the overloading of the circuit that involves the amygdala and the hippocampus. So those two areas facilitate recollection and the retrieval of that event with a great deal of information, including emotional content, without the proper ability to desist, to stop, to put an end to this replay. Hence, trying to get a better understanding of the relationship between emotional processes and memory processes has both clear theoretical implications from a cognitive neuroscience standpoint, but also very important clinical implications in the study of such disorders. I would also like to draw your attention to the fact that while this lecture has been primarily dedicated to memory, we necessarily had to bring into play also attention, vision, audition, and currently emotion. And the reason I mention this is because it is a necessary evil in the field sometimes to divide and conquer cognition into different blocks, into different faculties, which are studied in isolation of each other. But in reality, all of these components of cognition have deep interdependencies. Hence, if we're truly trying to understand memory, we cannot do so in isolation. We do need to consider its relationship with other aspects of cognition, including but not limited to attention, perception, and emotion. Okay, one last note before we move on to the practical part of our discussion today, and this concerns prospective memory. And I want to make a note about prospective memory here, because everything we've talked about in this lecture concerns retrospective memory. This is memory for events and things that have happened. Prospective memory is a rather distinct type of memory. It is remembering to do something in the future. And there's a basic distinction between time-based and event-based prospective memory. So whenever you're trying to remember at 3 p.m. to call a friend, or you have to remember that at 5 p.m. you need to be on a Zoom call, that is a time-based prospective memory. So this is essentially memory for the future. A related idea, a related type of memory, of prospective memory, is event-based. To remember to do something in relationship or after a certain event. When you wake up, remember to check your emails. When you get home, remember to have lunch, and so on and so forth. And over the last 2 decades, there's been extensive work trying to understand this specific type of memory and how it relates to retrospective memory. And this is an example of a meta-analysis. It's a research paper that tries to synthesize the findings from many published studies. And what they've done here is try to identify the locus, the main locus, the main part of the cortex responsible for facilitating both time-based and event-based prospective memory. And one of the main findings from this meta-analysis is that the most frontal part, the most anterior part of the frontal cortex seems to subserve prospective memory and event-based memory in particular. Okay, so this is a very interesting and quite controversial topic nowadays. And again, for the sake of brevity, I'm going to conclude this part of the lecture here. But there is extensive work in the field, and our faculty here on campus is experts in this field, such as Professor Andy Lee, who certainly covers a lot more ground on debates in the field of prospective memory in dedicated courses, in courses that target specifically memory. Okay, this concludes the main theoretical section of our discussion today. And we're gonna briefly turn our attention for the skill building section of the lecture towards the results section of a journal article, a typical empirical journal article. And the question here is, how exactly should we approach the results section? In previous lectures, we went over the abstract, the introduction, the methods, and the results section is a bit different in this sense. And the main piece of information, or rather the main piece of advice that I would provide, is to heavily rely on the visuals in a results section. And that is one of the main components of this section, along with, let's say, relevant statistical tests, which confirm what numerical evaluations of the analysis and the different comparisons in that section might tell us. And the reason I mentioned the importance of visuals is because the number of tables and figures in a results section is heavily restricted. Hence, whenever the authors of a study need to implement something, visualize something by ways of a table or of a figure, they also have to summarize in a particularly effective manner the information that they wish to convey in the results section. So at the same time, you have the opportunity to scan over to get a glimpse or a sense of what the results are in a rather vivid and concise manner by approaching and by trying to take in whatever the figures and the tables try to convey. I would suggest that before you approach the results section, you carefully go through the introduction and the methods. As you become more skilled in reading neuroscience articles, you'll realize that this becomes a bit less necessary. So, for instance, to be completely transparent, I have to confess that sometimes if I need to make a decision whether a journal article is worth reading or not, I briefly skim through the introduction and the methods, and then I look at the figures rather than going through the full introduction in detail and through the methods and then looking carefully at all the visuals. However, whenever you're just beginning to develop that skill instead of refining it, I would suggest a careful read of the introduction and the methods before you go through the figures one by one. Okay, so the main piece of advice is to go through the figures and the tables before you actually read the text of the results. And this may seem a bit counterintuitive. Why would you do that? After all, the reference to the figures is sprinkled through the results section. So it only makes sense, if you're trying to be systematic, to look at the figures whenever the results, or rather the text in the results section, points you towards a specific figure. However, the advice is grounded in the idea that whenever you're reading text, it's quite common not to develop a proper understanding of what the text tries to convey. Everybody has had the appearance of going through a piece of text and then realizing that they barely paid attention to what they were reading. So to some extent, reading can often be a passive enterprise rather than an active one that involves your reasoning and analytical skills more generally. However, if you try to go through a figure systematically, and if you try to understand what exactly is happening over there, what the different axes represent, how different conditions are represented, what the difference between those conditions is, and so on and so forth, this forces a bit upon you the need to involve analytical thinking. And you can also go back and forth between the figure and the figure title to refine your understanding of what's being presented in a figure or a table. Then I will suggest trying to describe as concisely as you can what you managed to glean from that specific visual. Upon doing so, you can certainly go back to the text and see whether the text confirms, verifies your understanding on the results section based upon what you managed to get from the figures. And most definitely you will also fill in quite a bit of detail, because not everything can be displayed properly and thoroughly within a figure. Okay, so this is the approach that I am suggesting, and it was recommended to me a while back by one of my graduate student mentors, who told me quite directly that the figures should be able to tell the narrative of a journal article. So just by looking at the figures, you should know what the authors tried to test, what they found, and you might also be able to get a glimpse into their conclusions. So figures equal narrative in that sense. And more recently, this is a bit of a tangent, I will note the fact that several journals in the field in cognitive neuroscience and in neuroscience more generally have implemented a policy to recommend the use of a visual abstract along with a text abstract. So some of these journals, whenever presenting to you the abstract of a paper, accompany that abstract with one typically big figure, complex figure, but a figure that tries to summarize in as concise and as vivid a manner as possible what the main points of an article are. So this is a bit of a novel change in how scientific results are presented, but it's certainly making its way into the culture of the field. Okay, so this is the approach that I'm suggesting. So let's put that to the test. Let's look at two different figures, and in this case, we don't even have an understanding of the paper based on introduction and methods. So we're just trying to make the best guess as to what these figures represent, just relying on the information in these figures. So not even the caption is presented here. Okay, and what you should be looking at first is the axis. Without an understanding of the axis, it's very difficult to get any kind of meaningful interpretation. So we see that we have chronological age on the x-axis, and then we have performance on the y-axis. Well, if this is age, what might these points represent? Could this be a single participant at different ages, 20, 30, 40, 60, and so on and so forth? Well, this is unlikely. It would mean that the authors of the study waited 60 plus years since data collection to publish this study. So it seems a bit more likely that each point actually represents a single participant. And if that is the case, you realize that this study has quite a big sample of participants that it considered. Okay, so this is what the points here represent. We can assume reasonably well that they are individual participants. The other thing that we see is that there is a particular shape to to this cloud of dots, and the line that passes amongst these dots seems to capture the overall tendency. It's a downward pointing line. So if you try to relate performance with chronological age, what this line tries to convey is the fact that performance tends to decrease with age. And this should not be surprising. By now, you should have a reasonably good expectation that in many cognitive tasks, performance tends to decrease with age, whether related to memory, whether related to attention, whether related to perception. So this certainly makes sense. And if you know a bit about stats, the numbers here also make sense. So since we're looking at z-scores, values between 3 and -3 certainly make sense. Beyond that, we would have to deal with extreme outliers. And also, if you're looking at the r-squared here, which is 0.37, again, this depends upon whatever knowledge you might have about statistics. This also seems to align quite well with the direction of the line. And also with the overall placement and clustering of the data points around this line. Okay, so this is one example of one plot and what we might try to glean from it. Let's look at something a bit more different and much closer to home, much more related to what we've been discussing today during this lecture. And what we see here is that there is an area of the brain which has been drawn attention to. It's been surrounded by a red square, and then we can see that red square magnified, pointing to this region. If you're really good, really strong with your neuroanatomy, you might be able to identify this as potentially the perirhinal cortex, but if not, then you can certainly find the name of that region in the next subfigure. And this is important because your ability to parse and to understand the figure relies heavily on your ability to process and relate different subfigures with respect to each other. So this is a sagittal view of cortex, but then you have to realize that this is a magnified view of a particular part of cortex, and this cortex is actually the perirhinal cortex. And this line graph is trying to tell us something about that piece of cortex. Also, just by judging the visuals here, you realize that this relates to a functional scan, because we already have an anatomical scan, and overlaid on top of it, we have this red yellowish blobs. So presumably these correspond to parts of cortex which are more heavily involved in one task relative to another. Okay, so in this case, whatever task that was, and at the very top we see that it might be something related to familiarity-based recognition memory. The last subfigure here tries to tell us something about the relationship between recognition confidence, which is presumably a behavioral measure, and activity in the perirhinal cortex. Okay, so now let's try to understand a bit better what's happening with this line plot. We already talked today about recognition confidence, and this is quite common across a variety of tasks in cognitive psychology and neuroscience. We try not only to estimate a response from a participant, yes or no, old or new, and so on and so forth, but also how confident they are in their decision. How confident are you that you've seen this before? And then you can judge it on a scale from 1 to 6, right? Where 6 would be maximally confident and 1 the least amount of confidence with respect to that decision. So this is a behavioral measure, right? And we can reasonably judge that this was collected at the end of a main experiment in which scanning, let's say fMRI scanning, was conducted and activity in the perirhinal cortex was estimated. So then the shape of this line tells us a bit about how recognition confidence stands in relationship to the level of activity in perirhinal cortex. And this is quite interesting because while you see an increase over different levels of confidence, so the perirhinal cortex is more active the more confidence you have in your responses, you can also see that this is not a straightforward line. There's relatively little change between 1 and 2 and 3, and also there's relatively little change between 5 and 6. So most of the change occurs between 3 and 5. This is a rather abrupt change, which tells us something not just about the sensitivity of the perirhinal cortex to recognition confidence, but also about the fact that this is a slightly more complex relationship that we might think, and the proper word to address it might be non-linearity. So this is not something that we pause a lot on this course, but linear responses versus non-linear responses are things that people care a lot about, especially in computational neuroscience. Okay, so to sum up, what we've got here is the relationship between recognition confidence and perirhinal cortex, and the fact that the higher the level of recognition confidence, the higher the activity in the perirhinal cortex. Okay, so now before we conclude, let's take a quick look at two figures from the BIA paper, since we are already familiar with it from previous lectures. And you might remember that this was focused on orbitofrontal cortex. This is a ventromedial part of the frontal cortex, so it's quite different from the parts of the lateral cortex that we discussed today, lateral prefrontal cortex. And it is especially relevant for things like decision making and social behavior, and possibly also for emotion. In the BIA paper, one of the things that they did is look at self-perception, self-insight into appropriate versus inappropriate behavior. But even if you didn't manage to get through the introduction and the method section of that paper, just by looking at these figures, you should get a fairly good idea what the story of that paper might be. So let's quickly look at this. And what we've got here is a comparison between what is called patients, orbitofrontal patients, and comparison participants. So presumably we have two groups of people. Some are patients, some are matched controls, right? So we're looking at those two, and if you consider the y-axis, which specifies that we're looking at self-insight into self-disclosure of inappropriateness, then you realize that patients seem to score lower on this axis than normal controls. And you also have an asterisk here, which typically signifies in many empirical articles that the difference you might find between two conditions is significant, or the difference between a condition and a baseline, so let's say 0. And it's not completely clear just by looking at this which one of those two things might be, but what we are rapidly becoming sensitive to is the fact that patients have negative scores on this, while comparison participants have positive scores. And if you look at lateral frontal damage participants, as well as their match controls, all of these individuals have scores that are positive. So presumably each of these points corresponds to a single participant. And if you look at the overall trend of the data here, you see that everybody except orbitofrontal patients scored positive values, while this category of patients scored negative values. So you might glean from this that such patients have much less insight into their own potentially inappropriate behavior. So what should you do next? Well, look at the caption, look at the figure title. And this indeed tells you that there is a discrepancy between self-perception and actual appropriateness, where negative scores reflect participants' overestimation of appropriateness. So clearly, patients with orbitofrontal damage think are a lot more appropriate than they actually are while disclosing things about themselves. Okay, one last figure just to sharpen this skill even more, and this is again from the BIA paper, and we're looking at figure 5 here from that article. And again we see the same things displayed on the x-axis. So we have two types of patients, and each type of patient has been matched against a control. However, what seems to be marked as significant here is a positive value for patients with orbitofrontal cortex. So what does this mean? And then we look on the y-axis and see that this represents change in embarrassment. And what this seems to suggest is that by and large, orbitofrontal patients are qualitatively and quantitatively more embarrassed with respect to some type of behavior. And this makes sense. So it makes sense that what's significant now with respect to these patients is a positive value as a negative value. And you notice here the change in the directionality of what's significant for these patients. But if you're trying to gain a better understanding of what exactly happened here, you would have to go through the title of the figure. And this mentions the fact that there is a change in emotion associated with increased self-consciousness, where higher scores indicate an increase in embarrassment after watching the videotape of the procedure. So one quick guess that we might have about this is that patients watch their own behavior at a later time and rated the level of embarrassment. We already know from the previous graph that they were more inclined to produce inappropriate behavior. Hence, this shows that they are capable of embarrassment, and the level of embarrassment and watching their own videos was higher than that of control participants or patients with lateral frontal damage. And this aligns quite well with what you might find in the abstract or the results section, the written results section of the paper. But again, while figures are essential and they're a great starting point, I would note once again that you should not completely rely on the figures if you truly care about a paper. So proceed with the figures and then move on to reading the text of the results and try to relate what is mentioned in the results section with each of the figures in turn. Okay, so again, the best way to understand this is to practice. So I would suggest that you go through the remaining figures in the BIA paper and try to make sense of them before you read the text. And upon doing so, try to go through the text of the results section as well and see how well it aligns with what you managed to glean from the figures and the tables of this empirical article. Okay, so this concludes the lecture for today. And next week, I look forward to continuing our conversation with a discussion about emotion.